Hello, this is the Tavana course, Standards for Free and Fair Elections. My name is Andrew Blick. I am lecturer in Politics and Contemporary History, King's College London. I was Research Fellow to the first ever United Kingdom parliamentary inquiry into whether or not the UK should obtain a written constitution. As a historian, I specialise in constitutional history and democratic reform. I've worked with a number of groups internationally involved in democratic assessment and reform campaigning, based in countries including Turkey, Ukraine and Pakistan. Please watch this lecture before the relevant live discussion session. Also, after this lecture and before the live discussion session, as your assignment, write down what you believe to be the greatest misuse of an election that can take place and the greatest benefit that can come from an election. In this lecture, I'll be talking about circumstances in which elections have brought about desirable outcomes and also how elections can be associated with problematic outcomes. To begin with, I'm going to talk about the positive side, the goods that can come from elections, particularly if they're conducted in accordance with all the principles, rules, standards, practices that I've been talking about in previous lectures. To begin with, elections can be very useful if they achieve wide public engagement in political decision making. In a way, that's the crucial aspect, is that they ensure that the people, the wider people who under a democratic system are supposed to be ultimately the rulers, are actually involved in what is a genuine decision. In the case of an election in a representative democracy, that decision is who should be in charge, who should be making decisions on behalf of all of us. And if that decision is going to be meaningful, you have to have all the features of democracy of which I've already spoken, such as parties which present or try to present clear programs so there's a meaningful choice presented to the electorate, and so on and so forth. So that decision has to be informed by a media debate, informed by freedom of discussion, and obviously they have to be able to make their decision without fear of intimidation, and it has to be possible for them to take part. It has to be possible for them to register to vote, to have the right to vote. So all these factors come together to enable this decision. And if an election can be the focus for all of that involvement, that's a very, very useful purpose and a success for an election. Another way in which an election can be successful is that it achieves a changeover in the governing group in a society in a peaceful fashion. Because when we talk about democracy, the values of democracy, hopefully one of the chief principles, one of the chief things which democracy can achieve for us is that it provides an environment in which we can disagree with each other, we can have arguments internally, we can argue, we can have contests, we can battle with each other, but in a non-violent way, in a way that observes key principles like human dignity, equality, the rule of law, in a way which doesn't lead, crucially, to violence, to major civil disruption, in a way which everybody feels like they were treated fairly. So democracy can achieve that that's a value of democracy, is that it allows for these disputes, it allows for a contestation of ideas and different social forces, but it contains that dispute, that argument, within the realms of acceptable behaviour, and allows us to go forward and continue to function as a society after that dispute has happened. So a free and fair election in a democratic society can achieve that kind of dispute and avoid violence. And an important aspect of that is that sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, an election can signal the passing of power from one group to another group. One democratic elected government has a term of office. Some members of the public decide to vote against it and vote for a different group. That other group comes to power, and everybody, winners and losers alike, accepts that's what's happened. That was a free and fair process, and they do not resort to violence. They remain bought into the system. So all the parties don't become anti-system parties. The losers don't then reject the system. The losers accept the system and try and do better next time under that same system. So a transition has taken place without a descent into major disorder, violence, civil war, persecution, etc., etc. And the possibility is left open for another transition in future. So if an election can achieve that, that's a real success. So and that's one of the things that a free and fair election can strive towards. As an extension of that, an election can promote consensus around core values, so that even when we are disagreeing on particular policies, particular ways forward, we're taking part in a shared dialogue and almost a celebration of democracy, is what an election can be. And a further extension still, elections can historically provide a focus for transition. We've seen that they can enable us within an already existing democratic system to transit from one government, one democratic elected government, to another. Also, elections can provide a focus for a transition from a more authoritarian system to a more democratic system. So it can happen often when an election goes wrong in some way for an authoritarian system. It can provide the occasion for protest. It can provide people with an opportunity to object to the non-democratic, manipulated ways in which that election was held, and in that sense can help facilitate a transition to a more democratic system. The other way in which a democratic, free and fair election can be helpful is after a transition has taken place, after there's been agreement to a new system to be introduced, as for instance in South Africa during the 1990s, after all that has happened, it's possible to then hold a new free and fair election under the new rules, and that becomes an important moment of inauguration for the new order going forward. So again, that's where an election can provide a really important focus for that kind of transition. So elections can potentially be very valuable devices in the promotion, the sustenance, and the maintenance of democracy. However, and this is one of the reasons we have to carry out these kind of assessments, because after all, if elections are always perfect, I wouldn't be here talking to you about them. There would be no need. It's important to be aware of some of the key things that can go wrong if the principles I've been talking about, the practices, the rules, the regulations, aren't adhered to. So what kind of things can go wrong? What kind of things need to be watched out for? Clearly, as I've said at the beginning, these lectures, having an election is absolutely integral to democracy. We could not really conceive of representative democracy as it exists in the contemporary world without the holding of elections. However, simply having an election does not mean a country is a democracy or is adhering fully to democratic values. And these two core features of democratic, meaningfully democratic elections, that is contestation and wide participation, have to be fulfilled, along with various other important stipulations, rule of law, freedom of expression, so on and so forth. All of that has to be met, or you can't really guarantee that an election actually is a democratic election, is a free and fair election, is actually delivering on the democratic principles it purports to. But what's interesting is that regimes around the world now, even those that are not democratic or clearly far more authoritarian than would be ideal according to democratic principles, these regimes do feel a need to hold elections, to at least present the semblance of a democratic system, even if the reality is quite different. So there is a need to hold these elections. And as we've discussed previously, the holding of these elections, even if they're not genuinely free and fair, does present openings, because it creates the impression that there should be a choice, even if there isn't one. It can provide a basis for protest and for demands that the election becomes more real. But they hold these elections, and what do they do with them? What can actually be done with these elections to make sure that they don't actually deliver on democratic principles, that the authoritarian government can ensure that the election remains simply an ornament, simply a trapping of democracy and not real democracy? Or clearly they can manipulate the election in a variety of ways, and established groups can do this. They can compromise the various principles that we've been talking about. They can exclude, either formally or in practice, certain parties from running. They can restrict freedom of expression. They can restrict the franchise. They can apply arbitrary rules. They can override the rule of law. In fact, all the kind of tools that are available to an authoritarian government can be deployed precisely to ensure that elections are not democratic. So in that sense, authoritarianism can become self-sustaining. It can call elections but use the powers that it possesses in order to subvert that election and prevent it from actually being directed meaningfully towards democracy. It can backfire, as I've suggested, but this is what can happen. So that's when a kind of what we might call a fake election or a window dressing election takes place. That's the kind of manipulation that can go on. There are also potentials for elections to mark a period in which a society, rather than simply maintaining its authoritarian status, actually transitions in a more authoritarian direction. We would hope that elections can help to promote democracy, can help to enrich and sustain democracy, or perhaps can even lead away from a more authoritarian system to a more democratic one. But potentially an election can lead to a victory for forces which are less than democratic in their outlook, particularly if that election is manipulated to begin with. So if an election is not conducted in accordance with the principles we're talking about on this course, then there can be problems. If, for instance, one or more parties are running on clearly anti-system programs or even anti-democratic programs in that election, and if they're successful in that election, that can clearly lead on to a regime which helps to degenerate such democratic values as exist. If an election produces or aggravates already existing social cleavages or major divisions along religious or ethnic lines, that can be a problem. If the system doesn't serve to actually deal with some of those problems, it can lead on to anti-democratic outcomes. that could be a problem. And I suppose this is a crucial feature, that if an election doesn't succeed in, to some extent, overcoming pre-existing divisions in society and bring people together, even if it's just to disagree, but to disagree about a shared process, this is a problem. And a final problem which can emerge with elections, and which can mean that they haven't performed their hopefully their valuable function, is if we get a degeneration or continuation of non-programmatic populism. If a party is elected promising either very little, based around maybe a charismatic leader, or at the other end of the scale promising too much that can't be delivered, this can be an issue, that it can lead to a government elected which isn't clearly accountable and which serves to undermine the democratic system. This can also lead on to other problems, such as in some societies the military may see a need to intervene, may see the need to stage a coup because it judges that a party has been elected which simply isn't appropriate, or it may lead to a party not accepting that it's lost and trying to circumvent the result of an election. And ultimately that comes down to the really fatal point in any election, is that if there are clearly aggrieved groups, not aggrieved because they've lost an election fairly and they're unhappy that they lost, but aggrieved because they do not accept the system, they do not accept the result. They reject a result either because they feel that it's undemocratic, or because they do not like democracy, that they feel that the democratic system is flawed. If that rejection happens, then you're into potentially serious difficulties. Those are the negative possible consequences of a democracy. We have to look at the negatives, but in order to take them forward and find ways of avoiding them in future, because potentially free and fair elections are a crucial plank in a functioning, stable, democratic society. Thank you.